So, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming and joining us tonight. And thank you to Bonaventure for coming to Hong Kong for a residency and for agreeing to share with us his work. You can all read about him on the papers, but I would just like to add that Bonaventure really created in the last years one of the most radical and original institutions in Europe for contemporary art. And he brought a much needed perspective to the arts in Berlin and started a conversation that I think influenced a lot of people's practices and really changed very much the discourse in the city, which is an important art capital in Europe. And also, Bonaventure wrote a very, I think, visible and decisive contribution to the past Documenta in Athens of last year, something that also contributed to a lot of discussions. So it's a great honor to have him with us, and he will share some of his thoughts and some of his work at SAVI, his institution with him. So I give the floor to you. Thanks again.
Thank you. So I'll also say a few words of thanks. Thanks a lot, Cosme, for inviting me, and to Chang and all the Parasite team for receiving me so warmly. And I recognize a few faces here. I am very happy that you found the time to come by. I must say, maybe this is what we should do, just listen to music all evening. I must say I haven't been for even more than 30 hours in Hong Kong, and I like it quite a lot. The first impression, my gut feeling, I kind of trust. And Inti was so kind to show me around yesterday, and we ended up listening to some good music. We found a jazz club, and I think it could continue like this for the next 7 days. I'm really happy to be here, I just want to say, and thank you all. So what I'm going to do tonight is just talk about SAVI Contemporary, talk about my practice as an exhibition maker. I'm actually more interested in a conversation, so I will read bits and pieces of a few things I prepared. I'll start with a general comment on what SAVI is. It's something that's cut out from a kind of manifesto, So SAVI was founded 8 years ago, in 2009 in Berlin, and it was born out of a very deep need to create something else in Berlin. And this something else was, to me, basically the fact that Berlin at that point in time, and since the 90s when I came to Berlin, had claimed to be a kind of a capital of the art world in some way. And I found it a very interesting space, but what I thought was that there was a very strong Euro-American axis, which is not to say that it's bad, but it's not reflective of the world. So I wanted to create a space where we could invite artists that come from the four corners of the globe. It's called the interlude. So every once in a while you hear that sound. I don't know why, but well. Nice too. Okay, so that was the idea. So to create a space where we could bring in other discourses, philosophies from the African continent, from Asia, from the Caribbean especially, and of course not forgetting where we were. So that was the idea, and started off in a very small space. And this is Savvy today. I like to show this image to give people the impression that Savvy is everything, but it's not. It's just to give that impression. We are actually underneath. So it's 350 square meters under this space. The building you see is a former crematorium in Berlin-Wedding. And it was acquired by a guy who was a filmmaker, Jörg Heitmann. And he's made a cultural space called Silent Green. So Savvy Contemporary is in that building underneath. And you'll see some images of the Kuppelhalle. So if you go straight on there, there is an octagonal shaped space which we use for performances. And Savvy is a performance-driven space, so we do a lot of performances in the year, and so we use that space and hang out around there. So, as I said, I'm really interested in the conversation, so I'll read bits and pieces, but please feel free to interrupt at any point in time and ask questions. And if we could just start the questioning right now, but I'll give a kind of an intro, and then show some images of 3 shows that we did in 2017, just to give you an impression of what we're doing. Savvy Contemporary, the Laboratory of Form Ideas, is a discursive platform, eating, drinking spot, Njangi House.
Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. Never before had a radio broadcast provoked such outrage or such chaos. Upwards of 1 million people convinced, if only briefly, that the United States was being laid waste by alien invaders, and a nation left to wonder how they possibly could have been so gullible. Brilliantly directed by Welles, The War of the Worlds would become in the end the most famous radio program in history, known forever after as the Panic Broadcast. Yet it all began unremarkably at a little past 8 o'clock in the East, a Sunday evening like any other in America, with dinners being finished, dishes washed, and radios across the country turned on, more or less in unison.
The broadcasting system station to present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the air in the War of the Worlds by
A space for conviviality. Savvy Contemporary situates itself at the threshold of notions and constructs of the West and non-West, primarily to understand and negotiate between, and obviously to deconstruct the ideologies and connotations eminent to such constructs. For this, it seems appropriate to invoke, convoke, or deploy the cosmogenic powers of artists and artistic practice to guide us. On this journey, Savvy Contemporary engages in what Paget-Henry would call the poetic power of artistic practice, to unname and rename, to deinstitute and reinstitute selves, undertone imposed voices, and unsilence suppressed voices in an effort to resolve crisis of entrapment. Being conscious of the basis geography and the history of power, Savvy Contemporary has defined as one of its focal points the urge to deliberate and experiment on issues of conviviality and hospitality. Taking into consideration the rise of xenophobic and racial violence, widening gaps in class and economic realities, revamped hegemonic structures over the past years and decades, the necessity to reflect about hospitality seems to be more important than ever. Derrida sees in the concept of hospitality an ambiguity that stems far back from its Proto-Indo-European etymological derivation, which encompasses the words stranger, guest, and also power. It is to this end that Savvy Contemporary actively and performatively tries out strategies of ignoring, neutralizing those distances and impediments between the self and the ego, the self and the other, or basically negating the existence of self and other as categories of differentiation. A possible method of realizing the aforementioned is through radical conviviality and sharing, or what Jonas Tinius calls deep hanging out. Savvy Contemporary is a space for etymological diversity, a space that embodies and screams out Bonaventure de Sousa Santos' postulation that another knowledge is possible. Vying to his arguments that there is no social justice without global cognitive justice. As de Sousa Santos states, the exclusions, oppressions, and discriminations produced by global capitalism have not only had economic, social, and political effects upon the world, but have also had detrimental cultural and epistemological effects. Thus, the urge not only to acknowledge the diversity of epistemologies, but to resist the tendency to universalize Western epistemology as the norm. It is here that Haraway's concept of situated knowledge, implanted within the context of feminist theory, also comes in very handy. By moving away from what she calls God tricks, that is the all-seeing eye of Western science that considers itself the omniscient observer. Haraway offers the image of the embodied, complicated, actively seeing eye, which is a split and contradictory observer. Haraway's argumentations for politics and epistemologies of location, positioning, and situating, where partiality and not universality is the condition of being heard, to make rational knowledge claims resonate in our practice. So we appropriate proposals on viewing from a body, always a complex, contradictory, structuring, and structured body, against the view from above, from nowhere, or from simplicity. And we push this further to what I would like to call associated situated knowledges, or just associated knowledges. With this, I mean, while viewing from these bodies, one also puts them in relation, association, and companion with each other and their sociopolitical ecology. In so doing, one not only puts the bodies, but also their embodied knowledges, histories, memories in association. In this respect, art and exhibition making act as catalysts. Savvy Contemporary's efforts are thus to produce antidotes to the epistemicidal activities that have been practiced all over the globe by accommodating and celebrating knowledges and epistemic systems from Africa and the African diaspora, from the Asia Pacific, Latin America, but also Europe and North America. In so doing, we have chosen to explore other mediums that embody and disseminate knowledges, like the body, like music, like storytelling, like eating. Performativity of different kinds, dance, theater, performance art, in an effort to swim against the Enlightenment conception of reason. By so doing, we scout out possibilities of escaping the vicious and violent cycle of re-referencing historical and philosophical assumptions and postulations that found their way and were fundamental in the construction of the other that was needed to establish a European age of reason. Examples of these are foundational perpetrators of epistemicides and othering would at best find a spot in footnotes at Savvy Contemporary. Why is it not playing again? An important part of our culture of swimming against the stream at Savvy Contemporary is working extradisciplinarily with people from 11 countries and 5 continents, trained as biotechnologists, art historians, cultural theorists, anthropologists, designers, artists. We think interdisciplinary work is not enough. One must be able to liberate oneself from the tight corset of one's own discipline. Thus, when Glissant talks about not leaving history in the hands of historians alone, he indeed does a call for extradisciplinarity, as a plumber, physician, or poet can appropriate the role of a historian without having been trained as one. Our effort is thus to go beyond the hierarchization of disciplines as well as the institutionalization of disciplines. By thinking extradisciplinarily, we acknowledge the limits and faults of our disciplines and advocate for processes of unlearning to be able to learn something anew. Savvy Contemporary embraces Lewis Gordon when he articulately talks about the teleological suspension of disciplines and the need to fight the forces of disciplinary decadence, which he describes as: disciplinary decadence takes the form of one discipline assessing all other disciplines from a supposedly complete standpoint. That's Lewis Gordon. Huh? It's the literary scholar who criticizes work in other disciplines as not literary. It is the sociologist who rejects other disciplines as not sociological. It is the historian who assesses history as the foundation of everything. It is the natural scientist who criticizes the others for not being scientific. And it is the philosopher who rejects all for not being properly philosophical. Discipline envy is also a form of disciplinary decadence. And then there is decadence of methodological levels. So, Savvy Contemporary, at Savvy Contemporary, we also concern ourselves with issues of language. So I must say that I'm very much interested in this issue of working extradisciplinarily because maybe just as an excuse for myself and some of our colleagues. So one of the projects we're doing at Savvy Contemporary is called Colonial Neighbors. So we started in 2011, we started collecting objects in Berlin. We did a couple of calls for people to look in their attics, in the cellars, if they could find any objects that kind of had a relation with German colonial history, which is something that's not very much talked about. I mean, there's a kind of a development one has seen in the past years, but at that time, I really had the impression that very few people talked about German colonial history. And actually, the point of departure was a meeting I had with a politician, somebody from the cultural sector, and he asked me, "Where do you come from?" And I said, "I come from Cameroon." And he said, "Oh, a French colony." And I said, "Oh, a German colony." And he didn't know that, he actually didn't know that Germany had occupied Cameroon, at least from 1884 onwards to after the First World War. So, and you have this kind of a very prompt reaction you get often. And he said like, "Oh, no, but for a very short time." So I asked him, "So for how long was Germany in Cameroon then?" And he still couldn't tell me, you know. So I said, so how long is a short time of colonization? So, and that was the point of departure of the project, you know. So then we started collecting these objects and contextualizing them, you know. So maybe I'm writing this as a kind of a possibility of excusing myself for not being a historian and still collecting these objects and trying to claim a possibility of narrating Germany's colonial history, you know. But on the other hand, I was also never trained as a curator. So at some point in time, I called myself one. Because as I was talking to Inti and to Cosmin yesterday, I was trained as a biotechnologist. You know, so my master's degree is in food biotechnology, and I did a PhD in medical biotechnology. I did a postdoctorate in biophysics. And at some point, I opened an art space called Savvy Contemporary. So maybe it was just a way to justify by talking about extradisciplinarity. But I really believe that one has to you know, free oneself from certain disciplines. As Savvy Contemporary, we also concern ourselves with issues of language. Language, finding the right words to express what we want to talk about in the way we want to talk about them, without the limitations of an inherited universal language, is of course always the issue in an age of coloniality and hegemonies. Shifting the boundaries of language is thus a trial on one hand to find a language to express thoughts that cannot necessarily be expressed in colonial languages like English, French, Spanish, German, which through their hegemonic structures and embedded hierarchical systems in relation to knowledge, might not be able to articulate certain philosophies and worldviews. On the other hand, looking at languages and ways of life like pidgin, patois, and Creole as possibilities of articulating the knowledges we concern ourselves with. Also, or especially because of their ability to stand out as syncretic languages. Their legacy as languages of resistance, the ability to embody, express, and disseminate subversivity and negotiate identities. Pidginization as a way of being also means commoning. A popular phrase upon farewell in Cameroonian franglais pidgin is "on est ensemble," we are together. An almost frantic invocation, an incantation of an imminent reassembly or togetherness at some point. This stresses on the need to network, to relate, to say the need to get together, to take care of each other, to be together, which is in itself a stance against the capitalist concept of the lonesome cowboy. From a slightly contemporary perspective, commoning also stands for collaboration, co-working, co-production, co-creation, collectivity. This should be understood as a concept of radical sharing. This sharing goes beyond the physical as we look into the concept of the collective mind, the noosphere. I'll stop there. So, after that brief introduction, I'll show a project we're doing right now called That Around Which the Universe Revolves, on rhythm analysis of memory, times, bodies in space. So it's a project which we started. Can I please have some water? Is it, yeah? Have some water? It's okay.
No.
Great, thank you.
Put it in the jar.
Very good. Thank you so much. Did you find the problem? You got disconnected? Please let me know if I'm reading too fast. Huh? Thank you. So in the past 5 years or so, we developed a structure of making exhibitions that move, but not the idea of the roaming exhibition, but exhibitions that we make in different spaces that we try to contextualize them in the spaces we're working in, and the different iterations of a particular project. So we started working on this idea from Henri Lefebvre, his idea of rhythm analysis, which was a book he published, which was published posthumously. And we started in Lagos. So we worked in Lagos with Kudu Sonikeku, who's a dancer, a performance artist, and with this kind of group there. So trying to understand the rhythm of Lagos, going into the city, understanding, the example, rhythm analysts give this example, how long does it take you to walk 100 meters in the city like Lagos, and how long will it take you to walk 100 meters in Berlin? So how does the architecture influence the body, within those particular spaces? So, and then also the noise of Lagos. One of the things that, and I come from, I was born in Yaoundé, which is also a very loud city, but I've never seen a place as loud as Lagos. Which is, when you get there, you understand immediately why, because everybody has a generator. Because the electricity company is just so bad. And so light goes off like all the time. So people just have their generators running. So the whole city is on this vroom, and which is something that we found very interesting. So on all this, so we started in Lagos, and then we invited another group of artists to work with us in Düsseldorf, a completely different place, but working with the culture of the Carnival in North Rhine-Westphalia. So we invited artists from Lagos, of course German artists, but also from Zimbabwe, to do residencies in Düsseldorf and work on this idea of the carnival. Thereafter, we went to do another iteration of the project in Harare. So it was obvious that before we went to a place, we invited an artist from there to engage with another city. So in Harare, we worked with Winjelele Art Station and a couple of poets and performance artists and visual artists in Harare. Then we came to Camp Nagel in Hamburg and did a couple of performances there. Worked with Hamburg Post-Colonial, did a tour in the city, did performances, reenactments of Tracy Rose's performances. At Camp Nagel. We had a lecture program there where we invited Greg Tate from New York and a couple of others to perform. Then we did the final iteration of the project in Berlin with an exhibition which I'll show a few images of, and a discursive format. So whenever we do an exhibition at Savi, we kind of perform the exhibition in a discursive space as well. So we invited Abdul Malik Simon or Trinity Minya. Gintersdorfer Klassen accompanied the project in all the different cities we went to. Mark Gilmore. We invited Jacques Cousil, who's a very famous jazz musician, and he made a legendary album in 1969. And he's worked a lot because he is also a professor. He was also a professor of philosophy, so he did readings of Edouard Glissant's poems and played the trumpet. So I'll read something from this and show you a few images of the exhibition. The title of the project, that around which the universe revolves, on rhythms of memory, times, bodies, and urban space, reveals that the project takes its cue from Henri Lefebvre's posthumously published book Rhythm Analysis, in which he tries to synthesize a new scientific field of knowledge through analyzing rhythms. He recognized rhythms in our everyday life, in our movements through space, and our interactions with objects in space, in interactions between the biological and the social. He famously said, "Everywhere where there is interaction between a place, a time, and an expenditure of energy, there is rhythm." Lefebvre tried to analyze everydayness, the mundane, the repetitive, the interference of linear and cyclical processes, just as much as the cycle of life, birth, growth, peak, then decline, and the end. Rhythm analysis gave us the tool to try to read the history of peoples, their collective memories, and understand what a society has inherited from its ancestors, how it cultivates or cares for the inherited, and how all these are manifested in space. To put this properly in context, Maurice Halbwachs, when he stressed that history aims at attaining an objective and universal truth, cut off from the psychology of social groups, while every collective memory requires the support of a group delimited in space and time. At any rate, in the context of rhythm analysis within which we find ourselves, the corporeal plays a very important role, as the body serves as a metronome, ready to perceive rhythms without perturbing them or distorting time. The body, according to Lefebvre, is a collection of rhythms with different tunes that result from history, facilitated by the calling on all senses, drawing on breathing and blood circulation, just as much as heartbeats and speech. Speech utterances as landmarks of this experience. These embodied histories in the form of rhythm enable the rhythm analyst to, as he says, hear the wind, the rain, storms, but if he considers a stone, a wall, a trunk, he understands their slowness, their interminable rhythm. We looked at secret rhythms, that is to say, physiological and psychological rhythms that facilitate recollection and memory, be it in the form of oral, written, embodied, or otherwise, wholly encompassing the said and unsaid. We explored the terrain of the secret, tried to tickle out lost and suppressed memories, which could be expressed performatively, photographically, and sculpturally, trying to make this context of inaccessible movements and temporalities somehow accessible, but not necessarily transparent or blank. We engage in public rhythms, that is to say social rhythmic phenomena like festivals, but also traffic congestions and city noise. We engage in fictional rhythms, verbal and gestural constructions and cultivation of myth. We engage with dominating and dominated rhythms. This is to say, we're interested in the power gradients manifested in spaces, how cartography, mapping, architecture become power tools, and especially how the remnants and ruins of the colonial enterprise still exercise power and frame societies today. Speaking of colonialism and coloniality, it became important for us to perversify and stretch Lefebvre's rhythm analysis into spaces he hardly considered in his reflections. We began with Lefebvre, but soon enough, we were thinking of the drummer Babatunde Olatunji, who once said, "Where I come from, we say that rhythm is the soul of life, because the whole universe revolves around rhythm. And when you get out of rhythm, that's when we get into trouble." So the question is Hong Kong in rhythm? Then we convoked Sterling Brown, who, like Armstrong, used to say, that man is greatly rhythmetical. But thinking about rhythm of time, space, and bodies in spaces, we needed to call on Kai Miller, who wrote The Cartographer Tries to Map the Way to Zion, wherein the Rastafari debates with the cartographer on the importance or not of mapping spaces. And I'll read a short part of this poem, a brilliant publication by Camilla, if you haven't read it. 2, in which the Rastaman disagrees. The Rastaman has another reasoning. He says, now, that man's job is never straightforward or easy. So he's talking about the cartographer. His work is to make thin and crushable all that is big and real as ourselves. It's to make flat all that is high and rolling. It's to make invisible and woodless plenty of things that poor people can't do without, like board houses and the corner shop from which Miss Katie sells her famous porridge. And then again, the map maker's work is to make visible all them things that should never exist in the first place, like the conquest of pirates, like borders, like the viral spread of governments. 4, the Rastaman thinks, draw me a map of what you see, then I will draw a map of what you never see. And guess me whose map will be bigger than whose. Guess me whose map will tell the larger truth. It is this larger truth in that which is not so obviously seen in spaces that most interested our research. So how does one think of the rhythm of space if one is not of a particular race or gender or class, or if one speaks a specific language or inscribed to a certain cultural or political minority? What does breathing mean today? Or what is the rhythm of breathing in the age of Erigana? It is not a matter of arrhythmia. He said, I can't breathe. So this is a piece by Lamia Horaij called Embrace. It's a video, so I'll just... it's a video, a photographic series by Akimbode Akimbii, who was also in the Documenta, but not with this work. So this is a photographs he did of Lagos. I mean, he's been doing photographs of big, mega cities, as he calls them, for decades now. And so it's about Lagos, but the works, like some of the photographs are taken in Berlin, but reference Lagos in a certain way. This is a piece, a part of a piece by Christian Nyampeta, Comment vivre ensemble. So it's this fabric, but also a video with interviews he did with 4 philosophers from Rwanda, basically talking about different ideas or philosophies of conviviality within the Rwandese society. And of course, it becomes very important if you think of the fact that the genocide that happened, all these philosophies of living together couldn't help stop the genocide. This is a series by Delio Hasse, who's a photographer from Angola, and basically it's been also photographing Luanda, the capital of Angola, since like the oil was found there in the early 90s, and Luanda became one of the most expensive cities on the African continent, and so, but expensive, of course, for the expatriates who could afford for it, but the kind of, the people from Angola could not, So what happens then when, they run out of oil, which is the case right now? How do people still survive in those spaces, where the rents have skyrocketed and so on and so forth. So it's looking at the influence of this in public space. So Christian Nyampeta. This is an installation by Ikiha, which is a collective of 11 South African women, black women, and it was a piece that was also that was at the Documenta in the Kulturbahnhof, which we then installed there. So from there on, you have the Savy Library, which is I think worth visiting if you find yourselves in Berlin. A very interesting piece by Alana Clark, who's an artist from Trinidad and Tobago, and basically talking about the rhythm of the epidemics. Yes. So please feel free, ask questions, interrupt. 2 years ago, we were invited to be part of a project. So Berlin was planning to celebrate one of the the most, one can say, most important filmmakers and artists of the 20th century, Harun Farocki. And so we were invited to be part of this retrospective. And so the NBK, the Arsenal Cinema, the House of World Cultures, and a couple of other institutions were taking part in this. And so we felt very honored to be invited to this. But what struck me immediately was that, with all due respect, I do not want to be part of that, in the sense that we will do a show on Harun Farocki without showing one Harun Farocki work. So the idea was to reflect, to find another entry point into Harun Farocki's practice. So we started looking at issues of naming, the politics of naming. So what many people do not know is that Harun Farocki was born Harun El Usman Farocki. And the way the Farocki was spelled was with a QHI at the end. And it's a very common name in Pakistan. So this icon of German filmmaking had these Pakistani roots. So at some point he changed his name. He took out the El Usman. So the idea of doing the exhibition was to speculate on why he did that. Why did he take out El Usman? And why did he kind of, you know, something I would call Germanize the Farocki by putting the CK. And I found that very interesting to then use that as a point of departure to reflect on the philosophy of naming, you know, and the power in naming. So I called the show, which I curated with, together with my colleague Antonia Lampi. The title of the show was El Usman Farocki, Here and Ayonder, on finding poise in disorientation. So basically, the first piece you see is, Harun Farocki, whenever he got somewhere, he was invited to come and do a lecture or to do an exhibition or to present whatever, he would, and somebody would come to the airport to pick him up, he would take a picture of the person. Most of the time they had his name on something, and so to say that he was very interested in what was happening, you know, with the name. Because in 90% of the cases, the name was wrongly spelled. And so he was very interested in that. So he was documenting that. So his partner, Auntie Eman, was so kind and gave that to us, which we then did a selection and showed. Another thing was Harun was very interested in using pseudonyms. The most common was Rosa Mercedes. Now, he would do a film for which, you know, he would write, you know, camera Rosa Mercedes, script Harun Farocki, and another name. And all these people are just one person, just Harun Farocki. So he was very conscious of that. So he would play with these names, you know. And what actually came out quite recently was, which I'll show you at some point, that already in the 60s, he was writing for, you know, like big, you know, magazines, you know, newspapers, using another pseudonym called Franz Putz. So nobody knew about that, you know, and it just came out recently. So we kind of tapped into something that is so very, actually hardly anyone studied that of all the Harun Farocki scholars out there. So it starts with two epigraphs. Any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it. Can you hear me back there? Is it fine? Or should I use a microphone? Okay. The loss of all that gave one an identity and the end of safety. And at such a moment, unable to see and not daring to imagine what the future will now bring forth, one clings to what one knew or dreamed that one possessed. Yet, it is only when a man is able, without bitterness or self-pity, to surrender a dream he has long possessed, that he is set free. He has set himself free for higher dreams, for greater privileges. James Baldwin, Nobody Knows My Name. Second epigraph. Oh baby, baby, baby. It's getting kind of crazy, 'cause you're taking over my mind, and it feels like, oh, you don't know my name. I swear it feels like, oh, you don't know my name. Round and round and round we go. Will you ever know? Alicia Keys, you don't know my name. So, it is said that there is much in the name, that there is much in naming. In common parlance, in predominantly Judeo-Christian spaces, for example, it is believed that a Thomas tends to be a doubtful and cautious person, and a Peter turns out to become the rock, which grounds his name etymologically. But a Lot, a Jezebel, a Delilah might end up with burdens alluding to their religious connotations. The point insinuated is that people embody their names and their meanings. The myths of certain societies even go as far as saying that kids, before they are born, already embody those names and choose their own names. But maybe this could be considered the gibberish associated to common parlance. It is said that there is much in the name, that there is much in naming. If we were to leave the historical and religious etymologies and connotations aside, names still tend to carry their weight in gold, as they open and close doors within certain societies. In recent years, there's been much outcry about selectivity, for example, for job interviews or otherwise, based rather on the names the applicants bear than their competencies. In her 2015 New York Times article, Appreciate the History of Names to Root Out Stigma, Morgan Jenkins elaborates on the discrimination tendencies in hiring in the USA, whereby resumes with names that sounded African American were 50% less likely to be invited for job interviews than identical resumes carrying names that sound like white names. Essentially, it is a narrative about racialization through naming, whereby unusually sounding names lead to bias. Interestingly, it seems as if names do not really reveal race, but also do not only reveal race, but also betray class and, of course, gender. This phenomenon is everything but new, as people have always been profiled as the other whenever they bore the names Mohammed, Shanik, Shimon, or otherwise. It is said that there is much in a name, that there is much in naming. As naming is also a philosophy. Maybe the person who has found the most accurate words in expressing philosophical concepts of names and naming is Esiaba Irobi in the philosophy of the sea, history, economics, and reason in the Caribbean basin. Irobi takes the example of Igbo culture to elaborate on his thesis of names and naming as philosophy. He points out that Igbo children are not given names inspired by television series, stars, flowers, cities, nor adapted from dictionaries or the Bible. Rather, a child's name is a philosophical contraction of parental or community society experiences at the time of his or her birth. According to Irobi, names and naming involve deep thinking and poetry that result in such complex names as Ehilek Buenfuman no Dilalualo, which means, on the day you will kill an innocent man, may I not be at home. Or Osundwa Gaba Gilodo, which means, in a time of war, we do not run the race for life on a straight path. Indeed, a reference to the fact that the family survived the Nigeria-Biafra civil war around the time of the child's birth. Those names serve as a kind of, Eselsbrücke, a mnemonic tool for the community, a reference and memorial to difficult confrontations and situations in their lives, and through the physical appearance of the child, they celebrate the survival and overcoming hardship. Irobi was making these points in an effort to put a spotlight on alternative spaces in which or through which philosophical thoughts are expressed in pithy complex structures of meta-languages in the Caribbean, in the USA, or the Asian and African continent. Looking further at names and naming as a mnemonic tool, in some places like in pre-independence Cameroon, where especially in rural areas, children have no birth certificates, the age of a person is marked by the person's name, again based on an event of great impact that happened around that time. Take, for example, a person who is 100 years old today, so that's last year, or the year before last, when I wrote the concept, would be identified as Mofo, which is the name given to all male children born after the First World War's battles between the Germans and the British on Cameroon territory in 1915-1916. It is said that there is much in the name, that there is much in naming. Maybe the genealogical bridge between James Baldwin's Nobody Knows My Name and Alicia Keys's You Don't Know My Name was made consciously or made unconsciously by Olivier Marbeuf in a lecture he gave at Savvy Contemporary in 2014. Marbeuf used the Middle Passage and the practice of giving slaves new names, mostly names of their masters, as his reference point to build a thesis around naming. Hailing himself from the French Antilles, Marbeuf posited that, like many other descendants of that African forced diaspora, although he was referred to as Olivier Marbeuf, he did indeed have his other name, his African name, the name his forefathers brought with them from the African continent. And while the world wasn't aware of that name, he knew his name and wasn't prepared to reveal the name to anyone, let alone people he didn't trust. It was his secret, a sacred power. Nobody knows my name. While Marbeuf knows the names of whoever standing in front of him, he has an advantage over his opponent. And he or she doesn't know Marbeuf's true names, thus doesn't know who he really is. This resounds and reverberates in Luis Moholo's anthem, "You ain't gonna know me 'cause you think you know me." The chant by Mrs. Keys is getting kind of crazy. It feels like, oh, you don't know my name, round and round and round. Could thus be flipped and seen in the light of the Marbeufian, nobody knows my name, and you don't know my name, as leverage and vantage rather than a lamentation. So we invited Shilpa Gupta. So this work like a photographic series and some drawings. And in each of these images, there is a story of somebody who changed his or her name for whatever reason in India. So these small anecdotes relating to why people would change their names, you know, for political reasons, for family reasons, people that are running away, and, you know, for whatever. In the middle of the space, we had, we did a research to find, you know, texts that Harun Farooqi had written in using other names, you know, so trying to lay bare this tendency of using pseudonyms. Again, Shilpa Gupta. All the work together. Samson Kambalu. Samson Kambalu was also looking at naming, but as he normally is, he was interested in a more provocative way of looking at naming. So he came. So it seems as if there is a website where you could actually go get a pornographic name for yourself. So that's what he did, and he got himself a pornographic name called César Kubush. So if he had to become a pornographic actor, that could be his name. So he was playing on this idea of pornography and fetishes and the stigma, you know. So you see the wounds on the feet, but also the idea of the fetish of the foot and the hands and breasts and stuff like that. So trying to get into this work through different vantage points. But I mean, they seem random, but we kind of tried to break down Harun Farooqi's practice into 4 categories. So one was reflecting on language, which he did a lot with you know, interviews he did with many people, but also reflecting on the German language. Another possibility was looking at his interest in the war industry, you know, and warfare. You know, like you take an example like a film he did called White Christmas, in which you know, you just see the plane and bombs dropping, you know, and he says this is the American gift to the Vietnamese children, you know. So and then of course the work he did in the 90s on drones and you know, war technology. So for that we related it to a work by Olaf Nicolai called Nom de Guerre, which is a work Olaf Nicolai did using names that were kind of, you know, names for wars, you know, like Operation Desert Storm, or some other fancy names just to go kill people, you know. So he used this. So we kind of, and also Harun Farooqi was very much interested in pornography, in sex workers, you know. So we kind of on the tables you would see short gifs of excerpts of some of his films, you know, based on these 4 topics that we identified, and we kind of put the artists under these 4 chapters. So his writings in film critique and so on and so forth, you know, so the gifts on the tablets. So the Priester and the Partisan, this is a very early article he had written under the name Franz Putz. So Ho Tu Nyen, the Nameless, and then behind that you have Aryani Damawan, you know, who did this in the Indonesian society, when people had to change their names to have Indonesian sounding names, which was a policy from the government. If you had a Chinese name, you had to change it, to have an Indonesian sounding name. This is Candice Braith, an artist from South Africa, white South African artist who represented the South African pavilion in Venice this year. And it was very interesting because the fact that she was invited to represent South Africa made her produce this work. What does it mean to represent a nation like South Africa as a white South African, So she invited a lot of artists to speak out, so it was kind of a mixture of them repeating. They all said, "I am Candice Braith," but then talking about themselves, talking about the privileges of being a white in South Africa and so on and so forth, This is Ferres Publishing, an artist collective based in Berlin from Syria, reflecting more on translation. Again, something that was very interesting. Harun Farouki was very interested in. So they're looking at translations from Arabic to English. And they made a kind of a lexicon on that. So again, the Savvy Library. This is the piece by Olaf Nicolai. So you had names like Veritas, Whirlwind, so kind of a poetry of names of wars. So, if you're still interested, I'll read a very short, I'll skip all this. I'll read a very short text for a project we did in the summer called the Savvy Funk, or Savvy Funk, which was part of one of the projects I brought into Documenta 14. The bigger project was called Every Time I Hear the Sound, which is I don't know if I write about this here, so I wouldn't repeat it. Which is from a piece by Muta Baruka, a dope poet. And Every Time I Hear the Sound was the Documenta 14 radio, for which I invited 8 radio stations from around the world to be part of the Documenta project. So the idea was, if I'm invited to be one of the curators at Documenta, what does that help me if my grandmother in a village in Cameroon cannot be part of it? So I was being quite egoistic and just finding a way to make my grandmother become part of Documenta. So it was trying to find a way of making an exhibition on radio. That's it. So for that, we commissioned 30 sound pieces from artists from all over the world, 30 new sound pieces, each of like 45 minutes. Then we invited these 8 radio stations from Indonesia, from Lebanon, from Cameroon, from the US, from Brazil, from Colombia, from, from Germany, from Greece, of course, and so on and so forth. So, and the idea was to look at radio making as an art itself, and to do very few interventions within the radio structure. So we're really looking at radio stations with exciting program, and sometimes with less exciting programs, but finding ways of, like hacking into the structure. In Brazil, for example, we used a very conventional, kind of state radio doing, classical stuff and bossa nova, but all of a sudden you hear this kind of terrible sound that we commissioned, so a kind of way of hacking into that. But in other places we use more experimental radio stations. In Indonesia we work with rural radio, for example, from Orang Grupa. And in Germany, again, maybe also for very selfish reasons, we said, okay, we will put up a completely new radio station. So we're collaborating with Deutschlandfunk, that was so kind to give us all the technology, the Deutschland Radio Kultur. And they gave us all the technology, and we put up a new radio station at Savi Contemporary. And so I'll read this before I show you images. So every time I hear the sound, on the historicality of the audible and the embodiment of sound space. Every time I hear the sound is a Documenta 14 radio project that explores sonority and the auditory phenomena such as voice, sound, music, speech, as a medium to write counter-hegemonic histories. Every time I hear the sound is a project that reflects on how the sonic impacts subjectivities and spaces, especially through the medium of the radio. Over the entire duration of Documenta 14, 8 radio stations will broadcast as sonic art pieces for Documenta Radio. For 3 weeks, each radio station will live stream in Athens and Kassel, online on the Documenta 14 website, and on shortwave around the world. In Germany, we also had FM stations. The radio programs will consist of the habitual programs of each radio station in their local languages, punctuated with 4 hours daily by art pieces for radio commissioned by Documenta 14, radio archival material, and relate parts of the Documenta 14 public program. Every time I hear the sound will also be accompanied by live acts in which issues on the phenomenology of the sonorous, the sonic as medium for historical narration, Frantz Fanon's concept of radio as medium of resistance, as described in This is the Voice of Algeria, Rudolf Arnheim's imagery of the ear, and many others will be tackled in and through speech, sound, and music. The project takes its cue from the privileging of visual culture to auditory knowledge in most Western cultures, especially in Greek philosophical thought, often reduced. Very good, thank you. That it always reduced the idea of experience mainly to the visual, building its epistemology of historiography mainly on the act of visual witnessing, the idea of autopsia, and considering the act of seeing as the principal source of knowing. The present of the verb to see, to appear, in ancient Greek language is eidomai. In cultures with a so-called oral tradition, history is transmitted through narration freely assume the forms of identifiable or non-identifiable vocal utterances, speech, sound, and music, including instrumentation. Hereby, sonority is fundamental and functions outside of the visual and written logic, goes beyond it, and can neither be grasped by nor fully understood through it. When auditory experiences are shared, histories too are shared, not only from mouth to ear, but are completely perceived by and encoded in the body through the physicality of sound waves, passed on from one generation to the other. Because, as pointed out by Nancy, if the visual is generally mimetic, the sonorous is tendentially methexic. That is to say, it has to do with participation, with sharing, or contagion. It is this ability for auditory phenomena to instigate participatory moments and create spaces of exchange and the ability to infect others that makes the medium an especially appropriate medium for a transmission of histories beyond words. With the concept of contagion, Nancy ventures into the phenomenology of sonority by further describing the sonorous as something that outweighs form by enlarging it, by giving it an amplitude, a density, as well as a vibration or undulation. The sonorous must find its way in space before reaching the body that serves as a receiver. The sonorous thus leaves marks as its waves meander through spaces in their becoming, and in places as they metamorphose. So just as a side note, we do a lot of sonic stuff at Savvy. One of the projects we're doing, which is curated by Camila Metwadli, Abhishek Nilamba, and Beya Otmani, it's a project called on Training the Ear. So, which we do 8 editions per year. So we invite sound artists, you know, to help us to look at possibilities of listening beyond the ear. You know, so listening as a corporeal phenomenon. You know, so the whole body engaged in the process of listening, and not just the ear is too small to be considered important. So I will just show just a few images, and then we'll listen to a bit of, you know, what we started listening to at the beginning. And this was just at the opening of of the Savvy Funk in Berlin. And so this is where we do performances normally. It's again, it's a very interesting space because that is where bodies, they used, as I said, it was a crematorium, so they would lay the body there for you to come and see for the last time before the body is burned, you know. So, I find that quite interesting as well, you know, also working on this idea of cremation and kind of working with the ghosts that are left behind. So this is a crazy Greek group, you know, performing there. So this is the studio we built in the exhibition space, and we collaborated with the Bauhaus University in Weimar. So the professor and the students were there with us 24 hours a day for the period of 3 weeks, making this radio happen. So that is part of the deep hanging out. So this is Sach Hoyt doing one of his performances. So every time I hear the sound, the studio. This is really in the middle of the gallery space. This is one of the collaborators from Deutschlandfunk, Markus Gammel. Antigrea, a performance and sound artist performing that evening. So, that's all I prepared for you. We can have a conversation. Thank you very much. Yes.
Very thank you for sharing a little bit of what you do, and it's great that you brought this question of naming in the Phenomenology. So just by saying that in Hong Kong, people actually live in duplicity because people have a so-called Western name and a Chinese name. And there's no rule specifically on how each individual acquires that name. And actually, in some cases, people change their given Western name at some point of their life because of, or modified it in a certain way. So I think it's a very relevant subject, which is not the same. When I say that there isn't a rule, it's because it's also in many cases people choose their name, so it's not entirely like a colonial force to the body. In some cases people would find ways of modifying that name so that it's queer.
Yes.
I'll just give you an example. So I have a friend that his given name was Felix. But as he grew old, he thought that it was more elegant and more sexy to be called Phoenix.
Phoenix.
So there's all this navigation that
Yes.
also you get very surprising moments when you encounter someone that decides to be called Candy Wong. Like, what are those decisions behind of thinking like Candy will make my social mobility
Exactly.
more in a certain context. I just thought that it was interesting to bring it.
Yeah, but those are, I didn't finish reading the text, but, I gave a lot of such examples of, why people change names, and, in many of the cases, it's also just, accessibility, or finding ways of navigating certain spaces, so because, for example, it might be just too difficult for somebody to pronounce my name, which is Ndikung, I might just want to make it easier, or find another name just to, just not to have this worry of not being, I mean, like, if I had done that, it would have saved me a lot of trouble, It would just make my life a bit more, a bit easier, So, or, yes, I mean, just, also the kind of power structures that are like religiously, so you're associated to a particular religion, so like changing from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, a political, religious decision, naming as a form of resistance, say, okay, I won't be called this name anymore because Cassius Clay are all like the white man's names. I want to be called, to use a Muslim-oriented name, so as a form of resistance, So and there are many of these examples, But it's also, naming is also a kind of as I gave in the very beginning, like the burden of a name, Like if you're called Bonaventure, you have to perform a certain degree of Bonaventure. That's just how it is, It's like consciously or unconsciously, you just perform it, You carry. So again, so it's the philosophy of naming, I just wanted to find. And somebody who's written extremely about this is again Glissant, and he talks about especially the naming in the Caribbean context, where he gives examples of the nickname, the idea of the nickname. So people go around with so they choose not to use the name that was given to them at birth, and the nickname is even more important, because it's the name that society gave you. It's a name, so it's more important to them than the name that was given to you by some person or your parents, but society gave you the nickname. So he looked very much at that, also in the context of subversing cultures, through languages and so on and so forth. Yes. Yes, please. The microphone is coming. I would say some of the work, a lot of the, some of the work we've done at Xavi depart from Edouard Glissant's thinking, you know. He's one of many people, you know. I started off in the kind of text about savvy thinking from the point of view of Paget Henry, you know, who's another Caribbean philosopher. But I mean, so as I said, it was important for us to bring other references into the context, you know, of Berlin. You know, of course, you know, I also mentioned Jacques Derrida talking about hospitality, but it was important for us to really go beyond. You know, this Euro-American axis, you know. So while being cognizant of them and finding them very important, it was important also for us to give new references, to bring in other thoughts, you know, you know, like one of the things we've been collecting at Savvy is a you know, considerably early journal on culture, which was produced in Cameroon from 1963 onwards until the early 80s, which was called Abia. So very fundamental magazine, very difficult to find. Even in Cameroon, you don't find them because for obvious reasons that people don't value archiving that much, you know. And so we've been looking for this, and so the people that made this magazine at the very beginning, you know, very fundamental in thinking of the space of culture in nation building, you know, very important. So, and then how can you do all these discourses today, you know, wherever you might be, without thinking of these people like Bernard von Loon, you know, or early writings of people that became politicians later on, you know, like Ferdinand Oyono, you know, and so on and so forth, you know. So they were very important. They're very important in our practice, you know. So what were they writing about? How are these thoughts still important in our day, you know? So Glissant is just one of the many examples, you know. Yeah. Yeah, but as I said, we consider ourselves a kind of a discourse-driven space. So we make exhibitions, we make projects around this. So when we talk about Untraining the Ear, of course we are also relating to Pauline Oliveros, you know, who wrote about and talked and performed deep listening. You know, so we really think with certain people, you know, we want this thought to accompany the kind of curatorial practice we are engaged in or with.
I think it would be interesting to hear a bit for like the people in the audience, like how do you think an institution in general can disrupt an established conversation, especially in places where there's strong institutional dominance, structures of power that were formed over a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, just to answer this with a specific case of Cameroonian position.
Mm.
And what do you think you managed to break?
Mm-hmm.
And how was it?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe there's also a certain degree of timing, you know, that at the time when we came up in 2009, maybe it was about time that people, you know, it was just maybe, and of course we also didn't come, you know, from a vacuum. There are people that had done some very important work, you know, before, and you can name a couple, you know, Okuenwenzo's Documenta, you know, was definitely very important, and the other exhibitions he had done, going even as far back as the Johannesburg Biennale, when he did Trade Routes, you know. So, and people like Olu Gigbe had been doing stuff, you know, on different levels, you know, Salah Hassan, just to name a few, you know. Okay, then we came up at a point in Berlin where I think it was that moment, and again, I must say, it was a very simple gesture of resistance, you know. And of course, the idea was not really to say, okay, in 8 years' time or in 5 years' time, we'll be then part of Documenta. But no, of course, it wasn't that. The idea was just to try to do something out of the ordinary, you know. So those of you that were maybe in Berlin at that time, you know, and there was this whole thing of like a one night stand exhibition, you know, like every night people would do a new exhibition and so on and so forth, you know. And we were like, no, we don't want to do that, you know. We want to take time to do proper research, write about what we're doing, publish, you know, even as small as it was, you know, we did publications. So it was that kind of resistance, you know. So, but I think that it wouldn't have been possible if I were just to do it like on my own, you know. So at Savi, you have now 26 people working in that space, you know. People, as I said, from different backgrounds, you know, from all over the world, and we kind of meet there, and we kind of try to fine tune each other. So the idea of creating that space and speaking out loud. So already in the very first year, we started getting invitations, like you know, so like an exhibition was made in Berlin, I think in 2010, called Who Knows Tomorrow, I think, or 2011 or so, and it was like 5 artists from the African continent were invited to do this exhibition. You know, and they were all great artists, you know, Pascal Martin Tayu and so on and so forth. But something was very interesting in that show. Hardly any of them was put in the museum itself. So you had Antonio Ole's work in front of the Hamburger Bahnhof, you had Pascal Martin Tayu's work in front of the Neue National Gallery, and so on and so forth. I think the only work, if I'm not mistaken, was Yinka Shonibare's work, which was inside one of the in one church there. So the idea was to question then, you know. So one of the early invitations we got, but why are they not good enough to be in the museum, or what is it about, you know? So even though there must have been a curatorial idea behind that and having them have the works out there, but it was important for us to question who is in the museum and who is out of the museum, you know? And it's something that has accompanied us until today. And like the article I published last year in Muse, about decanonization as method, you know. How could we think of decanonizing as a practice, you know? And the point of departure of that article is a big project that is being done in Germany, which is called the Global Museum, you know. And they've invited a couple of people to do this, you know, curators from different countries to do this thing. So my question is now, so what do you actually mean by globalizing the museum? So when you bring these people and you put them, in this case, they will put in the museum, so what is actually the idea? Is it then to create a new canon? Is that what we're actually looking for, a new canon? Or is the idea to put them next to, which is another trend, you know, you bring this and then you put them next to somebody. Is the idea actually to valorize your already existing canon, or what is it about? Or should we also try to completely decanonize? And if the big conference coming up in the Académie de Künste, you know, and it's fair enough, you know, and so we did a project in 2014 called Wir sind alle Berliner, we are all Berliner, which was curated by Simon Jamy, and we invited him to curate this exhibition because in 2014, you know, one of the few things that wasn't commemorated, because it was a very particular year, you know, there was a huge commemoration of the First World War, you know, the end of the Second World War, a huge commemoration about the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so on and so forth. But one thing that wasn't commemorated was the partitioning of the African continent, which took place in Berlin.
in 1884, from the 15th of November 1884 to the end of February in 1885. So the question then became, why is everybody celebrating something or commemorating something? But this event that actually was so important for the whole world, because not only was a continent partitioned, but it was partitioned amongst you guys for which you took your wealth. It's as simple as that, you know. It's just as basic as that. Why is it not commemorated? So we invited artists again from all over the place, and we did a huge conference, you know, thinking of this. So then 2 years after, you see a big institution doing like something about decolonization, and where you have like 80% or more of the people attending this conference that were part of that conference in 2014. Then you say that a small institution can actually, you know, the idea of the grassroots work, you know, it's not a myth. You know, it's actually just, you know, doing the idea of paving the way, you know, doing something, you know. Actually, it would be great if the bigger institutions then come and acknowledge that. Sometimes they come with more money and just go ahead and do whatever they have to do. But again, we don't sit down and complain. We just continue doing what we have to do. Yes, please.
I'm just going to speak. You can hear me.
Yes.
Because I think that what you're talking about in terms of kind of savvy, like to me, it really feels like a kind of experimental translation project or a side of discourse. And I think that in many ways, bringing people together to talk about how certain discourses emerge. Maybe I'm a very materialist kind of person, but I always feel like there's a material kind of history to why certain discourses emerge.
Okay.
And what I'm interested in is at this moment, like what you said, a lot of people talk about decolonization, and yet there's no kind of like very material movement about that. Like how would we, as kind of like people who are interested in discourses, create the new material for those discourses to actually not just be discourse, but rather actually have a systemic change?
Okay, a very, very good question. I think where I differ from you is that I think that, you know, and that's why Savi is called the laboratory of form ideas, a hyphenated form and idea, because I really am of the opinion that the idea in itself is the form. You know, it's already material. As soon as it's spoken, as soon as it's thought and spoken, it materializes. As a prefix, as a precursor to something that has to happen, you know, but it does materialize because actually you set something in motion. Now, I am really of the opinion that yes, something else has to happen thereafter, you know, but I do not expect the initiator to necessarily be the person finishing. You know, so there is like space for everybody, and people can pick up on ideas, and we continue. The ball should continue rolling, but it has to start from somewhere. So I think that ideas are material too. You know, does that answer the question? Okay. You know, to say, okay, the idea of bringing people together is already very. So I would say that I might be wrong here. Excuse me if I am. That before Savi was put up, there was hardly a place like that where you could, in Berlin, where people could come together in this. I mean, and sometimes when we do an exhibition opening, we have like thousands of people come by. You know, and then we. And when I talk about conviviality, we really mean it, you know, like we cook for everybody, you know, like, and we sit there and talk and hang out, you know, and so what then happens, you know, and I think that the fact that another institution can then pick up the idea or somebody else can pick and work on it, you know, then it becomes very important then, you know, because you know, you need somebody to plant that seed first, you know, or I'm not saying that we're always the people planting the seeds, it's not true, you know, but I'm just saying to say, you know, at least in our own chantier, in our own farm, we kind of plant the seed, and then it bears fruit, you know, because some other person waters it, you know, some other person takes care of the growth of the plant, you know, but somehow we invested in this planting of the seed, you know, and then maybe also we do the watering and the taking care of the plant in other ways, you know, which is like the library, you know, which becomes a very important space, you know, because, okay, some other thing we've been collecting is like a series called Peuple Noir, Peuple Africain, which was published by Mongo Betty from 1978 onwards until he died, you know, which is, again, you wouldn't find in a normal library in Berlin, you know. So again, then it becomes very important for people to come there and work on these things, you know. So if somebody, you know, God willing, kind of takes an idea from that to create a movement of resistance, then thank God, you know. If not, then at least we tried something. You know, we can just do as much as we can. You know, also take into consideration that until this year, SAVI was completely unfunded. You know, we didn't have a structural funding. You know, we had project funds, you know, every year hustling to get money from an institution to, you know, like the Kulturstiftung des Bundes would give us money to support a project. But as soon as that money is over, we have to start from scratch, you know. So for 8 years, we didn't have, so there's just a certain limit, as like very few of us were paid from the institution itself, you know. So we always had to do something else. So taking that into consideration, ideas are actually even arms and not just materials. Yeah. Please. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious about your idea about like place relocation. You mentioned it in regards to the exhibitions where, you know, certain artworks are placed outside the Wienerfestwochen museum. I'm curious also about your location in Berlin.
Yes.
You know, why there, or why is it important? And what does it do, what the effect would be?
Whoa, why there? Chance. You know, this is the third space we've occupied in 8 years. And we're invited to come to the institution by the people that kind of bought the space. And we came and we thought it was interesting. We kind of found a way to fit SAVI in there, and it's chance. So to come back to works outside, yes, we do works outside as well, and we're conscious of that, you know. And there are needs to act within public spaces. You know, we did, from the very first space we did the storefront of 80 square meters. Most of the work was done outside because we did a lot of performances outside, you know, dance performances where in Neukölln as a neighborhood, you know, with people from 160 different nations, and we wanted to speak to these people, you know, wanted to do things. They were not interested in coming into a gallery space to see paintings, but they wanted to see things, you know, outside, and we kind of created this space for them, you know, and we chose. So the concept of SAVI was written for Neukölln. We're adapting it to Wedding, where we now are, but it was written for that. You know, we like, you know, when Kerry James Marshall says, you know, I paint extra black people because I want black people to see themselves in the museum context, you know, to recognize themselves with it. So that's it. We wanted people in Neukölln to recognize them within art, themselves within an art institution, you know. So that's why we're still interested in going out with works, you know. Now we got into a space which is very charged. Historically, I mean, of course, with the history of Germany, but that crematorium was built long before. It was, I think, the first crematorium to be built in Berlin. But of course, it has the history of you know, of the Nazis as well. Now, we're cognizant of that, and we deal with that, you know. So we do the kind of what we call the cleansing performances, you know, where we're conscious of the ghosts of the space. You know, we want to take them into consideration in our work, you know, which sounds like, and it's not a joke, you know. Joshua Diagbo, you know, the artist from Benin, he says, whenever I get into a space, before I do an exhibition, whether it's a museum space or whatever kind of a space, I have to talk to the ghosts of the space. And with that, he means that whenever you step into a space and you leave, something stays behind. You know, so how do you negotiate your own space within that space? You know, you're not coming in as if it's an empty space. There's nothing as an empty space, you know. So how do you do that? So we find ourselves in this space that is not only empty, but it's extremely charged, You know, so how do we negotiate ourselves within that space? We're cognizant of that, and we try to work with that. You know, does it answer the question?
Sure.
Or what did you mean? Let's put it that way.
Maybe I phrased it wrongly. I was thinking in terms of like visibility and location, and so that's what I was referring to, but less to the public space, but in a way, yes, to public space. Once you have something outside, it's very visible.
Yeah.
So I was curious about like the location of Berlin for you, visibility, also in terms of having actually a physical location.
Okay.
Gives you a presence.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So now I think I get the question. Okay. So as you might know, you know, Neukölln, for example, is really now it's becoming, of course, gentrified. But 8 years ago, really, or 10 years ago, I mean, I got my apartment in Neukölln, and I didn't have to pay like how do you call it? Down payment, you know, because they wanted people to get there, you know. So it was, if for lack of a better word, a kind of a periphery. But it was very important to do it there for the reasons I gave, you know, the kind of community, the kind of community that found itself there. So the idea, if we talk about visibility, it's about visible to whom, actually. You know, in the concept of the rhythm analysis, there's a part where I write about darkness and darker times, because they say, oh, we're living in darker times now, because of the political situation, things are so bad, so dark. You know, I say, what's this fascination about darkness? You know, actually, for some of us, we do not want to be visible, you know. So maybe the idea is not actually light, but maybe the idea is actually for us to be in certain darkness, because as soon as you become visible, you become a prey, you know. So what are we actually talking about? But the thing about darkness is that within the space of darkness, we can see each other, but the person in light cannot see us. So that is the thing about visibility. So it's visible to whom? So if we decide to be in wedding in a crematorium, we want to be visible for the people that want to see us. Okay? So I don't know if you get the analogy. So what I'm trying to say is that for those that are interested, they come. We try to reach out to many more people that we think should see the work that we do, but not necessarily like visible for the art world. I couldn't care less. I couldn't really give a flying fuck. Yeah.
But it is really visible to our art world, so how do you deal with that? Like, there's always viewers, right? That like maybe you don't ask for, but they're looking.
Yes.
And then people, in a way, I mean, I guess that relates to ideas about kind of masking, about racialization, about kind of stealing and pirate ships and all that. But it's like, then how do you deal with that as a space, and how do the people who come to the space contribute?
That's a conundrum. It's a big issue, I must acknowledge, you know. So at some point you just become, right? But the question is, how do you resist that? You know, I mean, you can resist only to a certain degree. The question is, at some point, do you really need to resist it? How do you avoid being, you know, kind of engulfed by, so if there's something like a system, how do you resist being engulfed by that? Maybe we're already engulfed, you know, I don't know. You know, but the thing is, we can say for certain that we're still doing things that the normal structures in Berlin would need light years to get to, you know, discourse-wise, you know, the kind of experimentation that we can afford to do that a lot of other institutions cannot do. You know, just like the screening program we do on a weekly basis, which is titled "How Does the World Breathe Now?" You know, and just so this, you know, so again, your first question about what do you do? So I wrote this concept on the night Eric Garner was killed, you know. So I came back at home at 2 a.m. in the morning and listened to the news and watched this guy, this big guy, you know, saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, you know. And like what do you do? So to me, my own way of dealing with this was to sit down and write something, So those of you who know Rendra, the Indonesian poet, wrote a poem, I think in 1960 or 61, called An Angry World, And in this poem, he laments about the situation of the world. After 2 world wars, the world is still like this, and he says, "How does the world breathe now?" So this thing from Rendra and this Eric Garner saying, "I can't breathe," I put them together to make a film series where we invite people from all walks of life to look at this reality. To choose a film that that touches the nerve of its time. So we screen it on a weekly basis, and then we discuss, and we just share. So the question is that, or I don't know if So to me, the way we resist is a certain degree of immediacy. To be able to afford to, I give another example. Okay, in 2015. When there was the influx of refugees from Syria into Germany, we were certain at Savi we're not doing shit about this, because it had become, you could get money to do a project on refugees. It became something like, but we couldn't do that. We consciously, just the same thing like during the so-called Arab Spring, we said we're not, and you can imagine how many people came with projects, We said we're not going to do shit about the Arab Spring. Because again, then it becomes commodified, It's just because, because you get money from this institution to do it, then you do it. You're not really interested in it, So my question actually in this context of decanonization is, again, so what, if you want to do your global museum, how do you invest in that? And not just do a one-off thing and say, I've done my Africa project, I've done my Arab project, and then I move on. But how do you do it on a long-term basis? That's it. And if you cannot do that, then you're doing nothing. So then the question becomes, how do we not fall into the trap of, of this, the sensation of the, although the thing is happening now, So at certain things you can be immediate about, but certain we're not. So speaking about the issues of refugees, in 2014, a group of refugees had occupied the Oranian Platz in Kreuzberg. And they moved and occupied a primary school, a former primary school, the Gerhard Hauptmann Schule, And the police wanted to storm the building. There were like 1,500 police officers. They blocked off half of Kreuzberg. Now, around 40 of these guys, these refugees, most of them from West Africa, went to the roof. And they said, you storm, we jump. Okay? So this moment of power, we found interesting. Okay? They don't have anything in the society. They could be evicted at any point, But they say, if you storm this building, we will jump out, That was to us a moment where we wanted to act. So using the kind of tools we have, we did a project called something about, I've forgotten the title. Something keep turning pages looking for history on the state of refugees. So for that, we did a 3 days come together, where we invited artists, activists from all walks of life, designers, architects, to think about what we call an age of refugees. You cannot build houses today without taking that into consideration. That is what we were. We invited the police. We invited people that had left the police organization to do the anti-police. It's a big organization in Hamburg of former police officers that are not do not accept what is happening within the police. So the main speaker of the police was there, sitting at the same table with the person against the police. So as a kind of an art space, that was the way we could act within this kind of a context, with no penny, you know. So all of this, from money coming left and right, you know, to kind of put up a project like that. So that kind of immediacy is possible, and that kind of resistance is also possible. I don't know if it makes sense. No, please, they can, please, yes, the conversation.
You don't agree?
What?
You don't agree?
The conversation is now more important. Please. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No. Okay, it's a very good question. It's a very good question because, yeah, we try to do a flat hierarchy, but it's still very difficult because when you do an institution, somebody has to run the institution, you know? As flat as the hierarchy kind of wants to be, you must have some people that are leading the institution. So we have a group of 3 like artistic directors who are Elena Agudio, Antonia Lampi, and myself. Then we have everybody else in the team that can curate projects. You know, like the project of rhythm analysis was curated by Anayega, Sasia Kerbshal, myself, and Elena Agudio. You know, Abhishek and the others are doing their projects. So each person in the institution, you kind of have your own projects. Colonial Neighbors is being done by Linhan Balatbat, Yorinde, Malin, and a couple of others, you know. So they have their groups and they function within these groups, you know. The only thing I kind of do is like I have like a monthly meeting with them to just to understand what is happening. And then, but then they go ahead and do their projects. You know, they're invited to conferences here and there. And, you know, I am kind of a figurehead. Yeah. Yeah. So organization-wise, people, I would like to compare it to a cell, you know, where you have organelles, you know, and all these organelles are very important, you know. Without them, the cell cannot function. You know, the mitochondrial, it's extremely important. The nucleus is, of course, very important. The cytoplasma, very important, you know. You cannot have a cell without, you know. So these groups, they have these functions of organelles, and these artistic directors are just one of many organelles.
I have a question, just like you're saying, like doing ethical project, and how can you convince your, for example, the institution, audience, that you're not just empowering the ethical art or empowering the ethical people, but also you try to bring insight to the man outward, like Western Europe, also as like USA, like because now I'm doing a PhD in feminist art, and also I believe like you situated in the sexual difference and situated knowledge, you can bring some so different like or alternative idea about you making artwork to contribute to the maybe like predominant art languages, but how can you like substantialize your idea and like make it convincing to the maybe some potential supporter of your like art exhibition?
Okay, thank you. So actually, we do empower, you know, the African artists. It's like every other artist, you know. It's clear that we empower ourselves and we empower them too. So I think there's nothing wrong in empowering somebody, first of all. Secondly, okay, I want to put it in a way that will not sound arrogant. So I think that there are certain, okay, if an institution today chooses to work just with European artists, the institution is making itself redundant. I'm not saying that European artists are not important, but I'm saying that if an institution chooses to limit itself geographically, like many institutions have been doing, you know, along the line, or just to work with male artists, then you make yourself extremely redundant. Okay, what I'm trying to say is that there is a necessity, you know, not only because it's not a matter of giving space to somebody. No, it's also it's a matter of that other person, those other group of people. They have so much knowledge that you cannot afford not to welcome to exist in this world today. As simple as that. Okay, like Bonaventure Soh Santos says, another knowledge is possible. So gone are those days where you could, the idea of universalizing knowledge, you know, that you could say, this is the knowledge, this is the non plus ultra, you know, like, this is what is supposed to be right, and this is what I'm going to export to the world. No, unfortunately, those days are gone, you know, and I think it's about time that we started. So one of the things that I'm very interested in is like going around here, and I see the Queen Street, and I see the Victoria Street. I ask myself, but what was this street before? Maybe there wasn't a street there, but that space was called in a particular way. And what does it mean to lose that name? What knowledge gets lost with the act of losing your name? Or you know, so what does it mean that if you call a river or a hill, a mountain, you call it Humboldt? What does it mean then? You know, what was the name before? What if you call the plant? So there's a tendency that 2 generations after, nobody knows what the name was. So if you don't know the name, you don't know the use of it either. Very probable. You know, so it means that a medicinal plant that lost its name, probably you lost the value of the plant as well. You know, so the idea is that in the act of opening up that space and accepting other knowledge systems, then you actually do discover that, you know, a lot of things that are, you know, that are, you know, like, okay, so for many centuries, you know, people said, okay, the body and mind are 2 different entities. We have to think in the separate ways and so on and so forth, you know. But these are philosophies that we know in many Asian cultures, you know, or African cultures, you know, that they've always thought of the embodied mind. You know, they never separated that. So what does it mean then if you were to stay today somewhere on your island in Europe and say, okay, no, I want to believe that there are 2 different entities? It doesn't help you, you know. So just to say that we need to create spaces where people with different knowledge systems come together and share these knowledge systems, you know, and go beyond the fact that, you know, you say my religion is the right religion, so you have to respect this, you know, because I'm bringing civilization to you, you know. You know, that's the argument that King Leopold used, you know, going around all the, you know, the houses, the palaces in Europe, you know, to say, no, we have to do this. We have to colonize to them, you know. And that's how he succeeded in convincing Otto von Bismarck to host the conference in Berlin. You know, Otto von Bismarck didn't care. There were Germans going on business to do the thing on the African continent, but he didn't care about that, you know. But he was convinced, he said, you know, we have to bring civilization to these people, you know. So which means that you come to these people, you tell them, your gods are wrong gods. You have to destroy these objects. And by the way, I'm going to take them and put them in my ethnological museums. You know, unfortunately, that's how it worked. You know, and that's how it still works. You know, so the question is, how do we create spaces to say, okay, no, actually, maybe your God is actually legitimate. Why not? You know, Let's just think about it. At the end of the day, it's how do we live together in this simple way? Because we've come to a point where we know that if you cannot be in Cameroon and destroy the whole rainforest and you think it's not going to affect somebody in Sweden. Of course it's going to. It's as simple as that. You know, if you do a terrible amount of pollution, it's going to affect somebody somewhere else. Okay, another example. You cannot be in Europe today and be surprised about the fact that there's an influx of refugees into Europe, for God's sake. You know, when you see that, I go to Senegal quite often. You're in Dakar, and 10 years ago when I was in Senegal, I drop in Senegal, the first day I eat a tiof, which is one of the best, the wonderful fish. But a few weeks ago I was in Senegal, I had to wait for 5 days to get a tiof. Why? The big tankers, the big, boats, they fish out the water. It's easier for you to get a tiof in Spain than to get it in Senegal. Okay? It's as easy as that. So if somebody has been living on fishery, if your family has been living on fishery for 10 generations, and there's no fish there, what should you do? You sit there and what should you do, for God's sake? It's simple. It's not even it's a reflex. You have to go and look for greener pastures. It's as simple as that. So I don't see why people are surprised that people are coming there. That's one of many examples, If you destroy the land in the Ogoni region in Nigeria because ELF and all these companies are ripping out oil, it's normal that people have to go somewhere. Where should they go to? It's simple, So, it's going too far, but to say that we cannot afford not to. You cannot afford to do a panel or where there are just only men sitting there. It doesn't make sense. So I think it's just as simple as that, So we have a series at SAV. We've been doing it's called "We Were Not the Same," which is on different concepts of feminisms, which is curated by Federica Buetti, Elena Gudio, Nathalie Bikoro. We just had a performance last week by Tracy Rose from South Africa, and we've had 8 exercises so far. So the exercises come in the form of lectures, performances, and so on and so forth. So again, looking at different forms of feminisms, acknowledging European and American feminisms, but looking at also the problems that existed within these spaces. When Audre Lorde said, you cannot have hierarchies within these spaces. That's exactly what she was talking about. You cannot talk about feminism and you mean white feminism, where people within that are then classified. So you have to think of it, as you guys say, intersectionally. How do you think of feminism while considering class, race, and other issues? So it might be a project that you could be interested in. Cosmin wants to eat. Yes, please.
So, yes, no.
Yes, okay.
I have a million questions, but the one I'm very grateful for you said, because what you're speaking about is how people know things. I was struck. My question is about sound. You're doing a lot that goes away from the picture on the wall that might be a sofa piece.
Exactly.
Sound is something that you kept on touching on.
Mm-hmm.
The way that you know deeply, the way that your body moves with rhythm. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So sound becomes a very important. I hear it as a very important
Yes.
dimension of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Is
It's very conscious, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes.
How do you know?
Yes. Well, because we acknowledge the fact that you cannot see through the corner. Yes, but you can possibly hear something through the corner.
And you can't escape from sound. You can't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's another reason. You know, if I don't want to see it, I can close my eyes. It's very difficult to close the ears.
And then still your body will respond.
Exactly. You said it. You know, so it is the vibration. It is the waves that you get. You know, the sonic waves. It's the possibility of participating through sound. So, of course, the point of departure is maybe a provocative one, but to say that, okay, so through orality, one can also, you know, pass on knowledge. And through the sonic, even beyond the word itself, the understanding of the word, just through the sound, because the sound carries meaning. Yeah, so sound then plays a very important role in our practice for these reasons, you know. Also because a lot of the things. So because if you're looking for alternative forms of embodying knowledges, you would have to go through sound as well, you know, because most of the things that were seen were thought to be understood. Most of the things that were listened were not understood. Were heard, were not understood. So, which is to say that even if you go to the Loud Archive, you know, the sound archive, in Berlin, a lot of the sound that they collected from the people they put in the human zoos, they could not decode what were there, you know. So in the beginning, Hagenbeck and the human zoos that were, so they did recordings. You know, you have a huge file, and you have people like Natalie Bicoro working on that. And so most of the things they could not decode. They recorded the sounds for like intonation and so on and so forth. So that was one thing. But what the people were saying was very hard to, it didn't make sense to them. So people are working on that, trying to decode that now. But even in the intonation, they could not fully understand that. So looking for other spaces of, you know, and the way we understand ourselves, you know, through, you know, sometimes the sound waves, you like somebody just because of the sound of the person's voice, you know, it says so much more, you know. And so we're trying to explore these other territories. Not saying that the others are wrong. I'm not saying that you shouldn't look. Of course you should look, you should touch. But I mean, at the point where we've put so much emphasis on seeing, you know, and this pendulum between hyper-visibility and invisibility, you know, which is something that I'm interested in, you know. Either, for coming back to the example of refugees, either the spotlight is on them completely, you know, you see them, so they become that prey, or they become that problem in the society, or it's not talked about completely, you know. But what we hardly do is listen to them. How many times have you spoken to one of them? How many times have you seen somebody give them a microphone to really say something, you know? So for the CTM last year, which is this festival, sound festival in Berlin, I wrote a lecture about how the sound of these people coming into our society today would impact subjectivities and space. You know, so starting from the silence they would bring with them, the silence of trauma, you know, how would that impact space and impact you standing in front of them, you know, then to the way they move, to the very intrinsic sounds, like the way they laugh, you know, we need to think about these things, the way they fart, you know, the way that, you know, all these things, they would impact us, you know, to the way the kind of music they're going to make and the kind of influence it's going to have on society. You know, so we have to think from that sonic space as well, you know, and not only from the visual space, you know. So that is, so yes, I'm interested in. And I mean, maybe, you know, in March, we're doing an exhibition on Julius Eastman, who was an American minimalist composer, whose work has been, you know, a subject of discussion in the past years, and it's become very interesting because Eastman, as from the 80s, you know, in the 70s, 60s, 70s, he was regarded as a kind of a young genius, you know, got into difficulties, especially with drugs, stopped composing, and passed on, I think, in 1990, quite young. And I did a project once for the Marrakesh Biennale based on his work called If You're So Smart, Why Ain't You Rich? You know. And he had this tendency of reflecting on this, you know, in his music, you know, very strong political issues in his minimalist music. So, but what always worried me was that in the rest of the, you know, people working on Eastman, especially within the visual arts, and very few people knew about his work within the music, you know, music specialists, very few knew about his work. But whenever people wanted to work on his work, they were interested in working in a series he did called the Nigger series. So he did this series, very conscious of what he was doing, called it that way for a reason he explained, you know. So, but you would see people perform that, you know, in a big festival without contextualizing it. What does it mean? So he, as an African-American composer, gay, working in that time, you know, what did that mean for him? But what does it also mean for us to just fetishize those things, you know? So now we're looking at ways of approaching his work also from different angles, you know, like, you know, his interest in issues of economy, you know, his interest in religion, you know, like, and really nobody has taken time to really think about that, you know. And nobody, they've written 2 PhDs on this work, the master's degrees on this work, but still nobody's really taken time to understand his connection to spirituality, you know. He did a piece called Our Father. He did a piece called Buddha. He did, the title of the exhibition we're doing now is We Have Delivered Ourselves from the Tonal, which is a line he wrote in one of his scores. You know, we have delivered ourselves. from the prayer. You know, so we're trying to approach his work through different dimensions. So we're doing this exhibition in March with the Autolit group, with Hassan Khan, with Bartholomew Togo, with Annika Kaz, and a couple of others, and a conference on his practice. So using Eastman as a point of departure to reflect on bigger issues, you know. So one panel is like man, myth, Eastman, you know, thinking of the myth around Eastman. Another one is to think on minimal music and maximal politics, you know, minimal musicians that try that kept, you know, we know the example of Steve Reich and so on and so forth, you know, that reflected on political issues within their works, and or looking at another genealogy of minimal music, you know, going beyond the kind of narrative of Lamonte Young being the founder of minimal music somewhere in 1960-something in LA, you know, this kind of narrative of minimalism, you know, which we're not interested in, but we want to look at other, you know, possibilities of, you know, to understand minimal music, knowing fully well that people like Reich had to go to Ghana, to India, and so on and so forth, you know, to get influences before, you know, even coming up on stage, you know, and doing what they did. Even Lamonte Young, the amount of time he spent in India, and so on and so forth. So sound plays a very important role, you know. And the last example before I stop speaking, the project I will be doing for the Dak'Art Biennale would be on Halim El-Dab, another of such composers, very influential figure, to me at least, who's been completely written out of music history, completely. The few people that, even and I work with a lot of sound artists, a lot of people dealing with experimental music and so on. And I tell you, 90% of them have never heard, or even more, have never heard of Halim El-Dab, who passed on last year at the age of 96, born in Egypt, started experimenting with sound quite early. One of his first most important compositions, 1944, recording, cutting, flipping of tapes, putting them together, playing them, what later became, musique concrète, which Pierre Schaeffer, Pierre Henry, and the others in Paris in 1949, similar things, but you would never see his name within that context, That's not even the problem. Maybe it doesn't need to be mentioned there. But what about when he went to New York in the 50s, playing with all these people, composed a lot of sound for Martha Graham, important work. Composition together with Cage and so on. He was there in many sound studios. And people still write books today about experimental music and music of the 20th century, and his name is still not in there. I don't get it. So there's a lot of work to be done, if I may say. Thank you so much.